In today's video, we're going to be comparing my RX 7900 XTX with the RTX 4090 in Ghost of Tsushima, focusing on 4K. We'll take a look at native, DLSS, and frame generation. We'll do a bit of a deep dive on the frame generation as well. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. Like I said, the focus will be 4K, and we're going to begin with 4K native with all the settings maxed out, and I've chosen XCGTAO for ambient occlusion because that is actually the one that looks the best. I've got some comments, people saying it's HBAO plus. It really isn't. You should try it next to the grass. XCGTAO actually does a much better job with occlusion with grass. And it actually is technically a tiny bit more demanding, although not by much. Now, if you're not familiar with my comparisons, what I usually do is I run the same exact part of the game on both GPUs, and at the end of that run, which is about maybe 5 to 10 minutes, I compare the averages and 1% lows between the two cards. Now in this game, and in pretty much mostly all Nix's ports, AMD does have an advantage, and as you can see here, the 4090 is only 13% faster on the average FPS, whereas the 1% lows, they're practically identical. The 7900 XTX is 65 FPS for 1% lows, and the 4090 64 FPS for 1% lows. So anything that's within 5%, I pretty much consider that margin of error. But just a sneak peek, I guess, for the rest of this video is the 7900 XTX is practically very evenly matched with the RTX 4090 as far as performance numbers go. The biggest differences, of course, are power consumption and that sort of thing. But even as far as DLSS and FSR, in this game FSR is actually really good. For be 4K native or 1440p native with FSR quality, it actually looks really good. They both look great. Now that we've made it to the quest objective, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and try 4K DLSS quality on the 4090 and 4K FSR quality on the 7900 XTX. Well, let's see how they compare with upscaling. In this next part, like I said, we're going to turn on FSR quality for the 7900 XTX and DLSS quality for the 4090. I ended up completing this mission, which took me about 10 minutes. You're supposed to expose this fake samurai guy. This is one of the beginning missions, so I guess it's technically a spoiler, but not. You're going to run into this fairly quickly in the game. But anyway, if we were to compare the numbers at the end of this recording, we had the 4090 was 10% faster on average FPS and only 7% faster on 1% lows. So excellent performance from both GPUs and impressive performance from the 7900 XTX. Again, a very good example of a game that does have a pretty good advantage on AMD GPUs. Now, for anyone wondering, I am running both GPUs at their out-of-the-box configuration, so I haven't overclocked either of them. They're both running at their stock settings, which, you know, the XTX Nitro Plus and the TUF 4090 OC come slightly overclocked from the factory, but these are not really all that meaningful. But you could technically overclock both of them some more to gain some more FPS. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of that, just because they end up consuming more power, and the gain in performance is not really all that much, but technically you could do that. But for my head-to-heads, I like to keep them both out-of-the-box configuration. I think it just makes things simpler that way, and more relatable, because overclocking can depend, you know? You can get a better silicon quality than someone else. No two cards are the same, even if they're made by the same manufacturer and the same exact model. Now, one thing that is worth mentioning that I ran into, and I don't know if people are experiencing the same thing, but when I installed the 7900 XTX on my PC, I always DDU the drivers anytime I swap a GPU. It doesn't matter, even if it's a Nvidia and another Nvidia card, I always DDU the drivers. So I did the same thing for the 7900 XTX, and I had consistent crashes with the newest 24.5.1 drivers. I looked it up and there's some people that are experiencing the same. So what I did was I went back to 24.1.1. But I did compare the two drivers on my 7900 XTX video, and I didn't really see any performance gains between the two personally, but I figured it's worth mentioning because I found it odd that my game was crashing consistently. But anyway, next one is going to be frame generation, and we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on that one, just for curiosity's sake.
Wait, I don't want to die. I surrender. I'm sorry.
Now we're going to go ahead and throw DLSS frame generation on the 4090 and FSR 3 frame generation on the 7900 XTX. And we are using 4K native ultra maximum settings. And I'm just going to be running through this forest for a few minutes here. And then again, we'll compare the averages and 1% lows. And the numbers here are actually quite comparable to previously. For the 1% lows, we actually have identical 96 FPS on both, and for the averages, the 4090 is only 10% faster, so only a few FPS in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, they both actually look great, and again, frame generation and FSR run very well in this particular game. Personally, I like to use VSync when I use frame generation because I play on a 120 Hz display. And if it goes over that, it tends to cause a bit of screen tearing, which kind of sucks. But VSync kind of keeps things nice, neat, fluid, and consistent, which I'm a big fan of. But what I also wanted to do before we wrap up the video is kind of dive a bit deeper into the generated frames. We'll examine the frames a bit closely, check out the fluidity, and how each technology generates the frames, and if there's any big differences between the two. So yeah, let's do that. This part here is 120 FPS captured footage. I've slowed down to 50% so you guys can see it at 60 FPS on YouTube. And this is with frame generation on both sides. Obviously, DLSS 3 on the left, FSR 3 on the right. And this way you can kind of see the footage slowed down and just how good of a job frame generation does actually on both sides. We have DLSS 3 running on the 4090 and FSR 3 on the 7900 XTX. It's actually quite impressive. In this next part, we're actually running instead of walking. Same thing, we've slowed down the footage to 50% for you guys. And again, if you pay close attention to the boots, those are the fastest running objects or moving objects, and that's where you're going to see some of the most breakup. And we're very quickly going to examine frame by frame just to show you the quality of the generated frames for both FSR and DLSS. And while there is noticeable breakup on both, overall, for the most part, they both do a very, very good job that leads to a much smoother gameplay visually for Ghost of Tsushima and other games. So for this next part, we're just going to be closely examining the quality of the generated frames for both DLSS 3 running on the 4090 and FSR 3 on the 7900 XTX. And this footage is captured at 120 frames per second. And we're going to be skipping frame by frame real quickly. So this right here is a real frame, and I want you to pay close attention to the legs because we're currently running. And that's where it's going to be the most difficult for the algorithm to generate a high quality frame. Essentially, that's where we're going to see some of the most breakup. So right now we have a real frame. We're going to skip ahead one. And that right there is a fake frame. You can see the foot is a bit blurry. Now, if you look at this situation here, we have a real frame right here. Everything looks nice and clear. Then we move forward a few frames. And then you'll see how right now it looks like part of the foot is missing. That's because this is a fake frame. And this is a real frame. Fake frame. You can see a bit of an outline over here. Real frame, fake frame. And this is a fake frame too. Look at that. It's a bit blurry. Because what's happening is the algorithm is basically trying to bridge this real frame with this real frame. And you get this fake frame in between. So I would say DLSS does a pretty good job actually, because look at how fast we're running, right? Look at this is the actual speed. And if you pay close attention to everything else, I mean, everything else looks pretty good. Because it's not just the feet that are being generated, right? It's the entire whole frame. So actually, very good job here from DLSS 3 frame generation. Now let's take a look at FSR 3 frame generation. All right, so right now we're on the 7900 XTX, and we're going to look at the same exact scenario. Right now here we have a real frame, and we move forward. This is a fake frame. You can see a bit of blurring and duplicating almost around the foot, and then real frame, fake frame, and now you see part of the boot is disappeared, because what's happening is it's trying to anticipate this real frame with this real frame, so you get this sort of in between that is not quite right, but you know, you're not going to notice that while you're doing 120 frames per second, obviously. But here we have a real frame, forward one, fake frame, real frame, and fake frame. You can see the boots all smudged up now. And then that's basically how it works. You have real and fake, real, fake, real, fake, real, fake. So FSR 3 actually does a really good job here as well. Maybe a bit more breakup than DLSS 3, but overall, I would say somewhat comparable. Look at this. Now we have the whole other foot missing here. So it's trying to anticipate this real frame and this real frame, and this is the fake frame in between the two. Everything else, if you look at everything else on the screen, it looks pretty good. And then this is the actual speed that we're running at. So pretty good job. Well, that about wraps up this video, guys. Leave your comments below. Let me know what you think. I think both GPUs perform excellent in this game. The game is not perfect, does have some issues like using a lot of VRAM, and I've had a few crashes, especially when enabling FSR, so I hope those things get fixed. But other than that, it's an excellent game that, for the most part, is very well optimized. I mean, it runs extremely smoothly, which is very important. And with that out of the way, give the video a like if you liked it, and consider subscribing. Peace.